Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So, homage to the Buddha. It's a recollection constantly doing, because the more we look at this Dhamma and the more we see its structures and the more we apply ourselves to try to get it, at least for me, and many of you have expressed this, it becomes more and more obvious how profound it is. You know, this is not obvious. This is very subtle and almost strange to look at certain things in certain ways. And the Buddha was able to do it. He was able to use his incredible intelligence and wisdom to, the wisdom helped him see what was important to focus on. It's like Jim was saying, it's like learning to make it, this is about suffering. And the Buddha was able to use his wisdom to see that. It's like, I have this problem. I call it dukkha. I call it suffering. Where is it coming from? But then the intelligence to be able to say, to look at all of the things happening in the universe and be able to narrow it down to, well, this thing right here requires that thing to function, and to be able to also bracket what each of these things are. Because it's one thing to just say the six senses, but I don't know, you might be able to think back to a time before you were taught that. I mean, you have to be taught that as a child, right? When I was going through school, we were taught the five senses. Did you do that back when you were going through school? You're like, you have an eye, you have an ear, you have a nose. You use your nose to smell. What do you smell? I smell the guy next to me. It's like, yes, that's the nose, right? And it seems obvious because we were taught that very early on, that this is essential to being a person, is understanding you have these different channels of information coming in, and don't neglect it. These are what are affecting your mind. These are what you are thinking about when you're having thoughts going through your head. It's your reality is what you're taking in through the senses. And so the Buddha was able to see that, to take in all this different information and to basically teach himself what was important to understanding the structure that leads to suffering. And because it wasn't just for his own edification, he's not doing it just so he can know, because it might feel like 1% better to at least know where suffering is coming from and still not be able to do anything about it. What he was really interested in was how to do something about it. That was why he set off from the palace in the beginning. Like, he wanted to get to a state where suffering was not a problem. And yeah, how we do that, how we get there. Now, this dependent origination, and as we went through it this morning, is kind of how we get there. We trace things back. Realistically, we're talking about in terms of our practice. Most of what we call practice is going to be trying to be mindful as we move through the day, sitting and being there with the in-breath and the out-breath. It's going to be thinking about what we're about to say before we say it, and where is it coming from, right? Am I saying this because I am angry? And if it's like a flow chart, if yes, should I really say it? Yeah, and starting to do that, and that's mindfulness. Yeah, and that's mindfulness, which helps feed into right speech, right action, and which feed into right thoughts. Yeah, we realize we have to start changing the way we view the world, because that's informing the way that we speak and act. And once we do make these changes, because nobody can make us do that, but once we see the value of it and we start to try and experiment and we put it into use and we find out that it does make things better, once we actually try it, we find that suffering is not arising. Now, this is the third noble truth. It is actually a realization, and it takes I mean, we keep going over this. We've done at least 2 day longs that kind of focused on that, right? But once we see, like, somewhere along the line, we're feeling loving kindness, or we're feeling compassion, or we're feeling really generous, and it's usually after we say, "Wait a second, that suffering wasn't there during that period where I was feeling really generous, or really grateful, or really content." And then we got to look at it and be like, well, what were the conditions? What was actually going on? Because when we try to choose to do that, when we sit down and we say, I could really use a good meditation right now, so I'm going to be content. I say, I'm going to be content. I'm going to be content. Oh, there's an was an ungrateful, discontent thought, and let's get rid of it. Get rid of it. No, we're going to be content. We're going to be content. I'm totally content with the state of my mind. There's another thought. Look at it. It's just so ungrateful. This mind. It just can't stop being. It's like, how successful are we at being content when we try to be content? We keep telling things, I'm trying to be content with you. I'm trying to be content with you. It turns out the trying actually has a little bit of suffering there. Yeah. And so this is not even so much a matter of active choice, right? The dependent origination is also showing us the extent of our ability to decide how things will play out. Because the first two, the upper two, depending on how you stack it and order things, of the links of dependent origination, the beginning of the chain deals with avijja, or ignorance, and sankhara are volitional formations, volitional activities. Yeah. And these two, as you say, are actually past conditions. So there's something that the Buddha saw that really got him to stop and think about where the solution to this problem of suffering actually was. And it was him having to stop and think about this that led to enlightenment, that led to full understanding, because this is not something you can get just from practicing correctly. If that was the case, then people would do it by accident. You could tell them, just go off to this hut in the woods, eat 1 meal a day, send loving kindness to all the little critters in the forest, do it for 10 years, you will get full enlightenment. It turns out you can send them out there and they'll come back 10 years later. They will have forgotten how to bathe, but they will be really in love with the forest and the squirrels and all the little things, but they will not be much wiser. And why is that? Well, because it's not just about practice. There's a level of understanding we have to break through to and wake up to. So what the Buddha found is, as he was going back in the way that we did this morning, okay, so there's feeling, and then there's contact, and then there's the 6 sense bases, and then there's subject and object, there's nama rupa. And then he got to consciousness. And consciousness is the arising, like there's, in the way that, he started to see, like, one of the suttas said it out this morning, is that when the I meets the form, right, the visible form, the contact of the two, and then there is the arising of consciousness. So this is where we call it dependent co-arising, because you can't say that the consciousness happens and then Namarupa happens and then the 6 sense bases happen. You really can't say that, because the 6 sense bases and contact are arising at the same time as Namarupa and consciousness. And if consciousness doesn't arise, then there's nothing to talk about. There was a visible form and there was an eyeball, but the two of them didn't meet. So consciousness didn't arise. And because of that, there were no problems, right? You can't have suffering if you don't have the sense contact. Yeah, if the consciousness didn't arise. But when the Buddha started asking, like, okay, so consciousness keeps arising at the meeting of the sense base and the object. It keeps arising over and over and over. What is the condition for this consciousness arising? Because the Buddha was starting to intuit maybe consciousness is not the highest Dhamma. Maybe it's not the most important thing in this scenario. Maybe it's just another thing. And what he found very curiously was the condition for consciousness is Namarupa. He said, I realized that was the extent I could go. At this point, the dependent origination turns back on itself. And he saw that consciousness is the condition for Namarupa, but Namarupa is the condition for consciousness. Yeah. Why is it that consciousness arises? Well, because we think these are my eyes. I'm using them to see. Like we intend to see something, and in the next moment, because the sense base is active, and because there's light, and because there are visible forms, consciousness arises at that point. You're realizing that our expectation to see something, our desire to see something, was conditioning the arising of consciousness in that place. Whereas it seemed like consciousness is arising and then there is something for it to do. He saw that you can't find any separation between the two. Consciousness is arising at the point where something is happening without any gap. Yeah. And so he realized this is the extent of what we can decide to do something about. This is the extent of where we can apply practice and focus on the breath until we get into the jhanas, and then everything will be fine. He realized that only goes this far, and it still doesn't fix the problem, because the consciousness is arising not just based on my wanting something. Yeah. Sometimes the craving falls away and consciousness still arises. Of course it does. You're all still here. If consciousness needed any external supports, then you would have winked out of existence at some point and never come back. There would just be a pile of clothes on your floor, and somebody would come in and be like, oh, he stopped existing. Another one bites the dust, right? But that's never happened, right? Even I've never seen anybody spontaneously combust and just turn into a pile of clothes, because consciousness keeps happening. The conditions are external to it. So then the Buddha is saying, well, okay, what are these external conditions that are leading to the repeating arising of consciousness at the meeting of the sense base and the object? And this is how we get ignorance and volitional formations, right? And this is where we get into a different part of the practice. This is not something we can necessarily deal with just by following our breath and being mindful and keeping the precepts. This is where we've actually got to try to apply wisdom to understand how the craving that we might feel in this moment is not just a problem in this moment, but that it will create a future problem, because the craving that we feel right now is also reinforcing our sense of self and our sense of subject and object, and is causing us to want to have more experiences, which, because that structure is in place, there will be the arising of consciousness in the future. Yeah. And that even if we get old and waste away and die, because that structure is still in place, even though our consciousness stops at the time of death, the conditions for consciousness were external to that consciousness. And they were not just contained in these little mind moments we have going on all the time. The conditions are external and they're still going. So even though the consciousness that kept arising right here, it was Pamuto. It just keeps. That's why the clothes are still. It's not just a pile on the floor. It's because consciousness keeps arising right here. There's a Pamuto. Well, someday Pamuto dies. Yeah, the consciousness that was part of the Pamuto formation stops. But if there is any part of the mind that is expecting more consciousnesses, that is looking forward to more, that is anticipating more, well, guess what? They show up somewhere else. They're not rooted to this place. They don't have this name. They don't have this history. But there's a causal chain that keeps going. Yeah. So let's look at a sutta. Let's see the Buddha dealing with this. With Kassapa, the naked ascetic. So it's very, very simple, straightforward. I don't think we'll even do the whole sutta, but one time the Buddha is staying near Rajgaha in the bamboo grove, the squirrel's feeding ground. Then the Buddha robed up in the morning, taking his bowl and robe, entered Rajgaha for alms. The naked ascetic, this is somebody who's not a Buddhist, is just some other sadhu in the woods, saw the Buddha coming off in the distance. He went up to the Buddha and exchanged greetings with them. When their polite greetings were over, he stood to one side and said, "I'd like to ask the worthy Gotama about a certain point, if you'd take the time to answer." And the Buddha said, "Kassapa, it's the wrong time for questions. We're in the inhabited area. We're going on alms round." So for Buddhist monastics, the alms round is kind of a thing we do. We're usually living outside of town. We come into town as part of our walking, our begging rounds, right? But it's not for the purpose of being in the town. It's for the purpose of the begging rounds. And once we have enough food, then we circle back and we go back to the forest, yeah? So the Buddha is saying, the monastery is really the place for these conversations. It's when I won't be in the middle of something, Kassapa. But sometimes there's just a need, right? And so Kassapa says, he just asked the same thing. He's like, it's really important. I just one little question, please, if you just take the time to answer. And finally, Kassapa says, I don't want to ask much. It's just this one thing. And so the Buddha says, okay, ask what you wish. And Kassapa says, well, worthy Gotama, is suffering made by oneself? And the Buddha says, not so. Then is suffering made by another? The Buddha responds, not so. And then Kassapa asks, well, is suffering made both by oneself and another? The Buddha says, not so. Then does suffering arise by chance, not even made by oneself or another? And the Buddha responds, not so. Well, is there no such thing as suffering? And the Buddha said, it's not that there's no such thing as suffering. Suffering is very much real. It's the pragmatist, yes. So I shouldn't have to tell you that suffering is a thing. It's definitely a thing. And so Kassapa resorts to what's logically the last thing left. Oh, then the worthy Gotama doesn't even know or see suffering. It's like, if none of these are true, then it must be that you just don't know the answer. And the Buddha says, it's not that I don't know or see suffering. I do know suffering. I do see suffering. Worthy Gotama, when asked these questions, you say, not so. Yet you say there is such a thing as suffering. And you say that you do know suffering and you do see suffering. Then explain suffering to me. Teach me about suffering. And the Buddhists try to explain something very essential about ignorance and the idea of a person that leads to sankharas, or volitional formations. Suppose that the person who does the deed experiences the result. Just think of it. This is, if you get this, you will see how profound and hard to fathom this is, especially if you haven't been taught this, you're figuring this out. Suppose that the one who does a deed is the same person who experiences the result. And when we talk about karma, this is usually how we explain it, right? Then for one who has existed since the beginning, how could it be that suffering is made by oneself? Now, this very statement leans towards eternalism. So it's saying, if our suffering is because of the actions that we do, then how was it? It's like a chicken and an egg scenario. How was it that suffering first arose? right? Who, if we're the ones who cause suffering, then how did it begin? We would have had to start it. But if it's so simple that we just started it, then it shouldn't keep going unless it's just always been here. Suffering must have come before us if that's the way that this is. And then the Buddha says, suppose that the person who does the deed and another experiences the result. So say that suffering is caused by other people and you get the result. Then for one who is struck by an unpleasant feeling, suffering is made by another. Now, this statement leans towards annihilationism. How is that? Well, if in the first scenario, we can't be the ones who are creating our own suffering because there must have been a time before we made any actions. And that means the suffering that would have existed for us to create actions about, where did it come from? Well, in this scenario, if it's other people that cause our suffering, then by getting away from other people, that should lead to the end of suffering, right? If we're not the ones making the suffering, then it should run out. There should be a way of just getting away from it all, and it'll just end. Yeah. So the Buddha says, avoiding these two extremes, the realized one teaches by the middle way. And then he lays out dependent origination. You notice dependent origination isn't about subject and object. It isn't about karma and the doer of the karma and the one who receives the result of karma. Yeah, it's not actions and the consequences of actions. Dependent origination is about how one thing conditions another. There's no person in this, right? Now, our experience of many of these links of dependent origination is that it feels very personal. Yeah, when Namarupa arises, we tend to be like, oh, this is me seeing the object. But from the actual package of links in dependent origination themselves, don't even talk about a person or an existence or consciousness or karma or any of that. They're just talking about one thing being an essential cause for the next thing, for the next thing, for the next thing. Yeah. And very interestingly, while it's hard to kind of, this made a lot more sense in the original Pali, by the way, because this is just how they talked. They talked like this all day long. They just loved these little philosophical things and these little brackets of, does it exist or does it not exist? Does it both exist and not exist, or does it neither exist nor not exist? That was basically how they decided if they wanted to put salt on their curry. You know, it's the most common way of thinking for them. But for us, it's very tricky in English to get the sense of what's even being said here. But we can't be the ones who do suffering, right? Because there would have been a time before we were doing anything, and that suffering was still there. Suffering is part of this samsara, is part of why we're trapped in samsara, right? It's one and the same. But then we're not the reason that suffering is arising either, because we're obviously keeping it going, right? And you just have to look for a minute to see that the choices we make are affecting our level of suffering. If not, there would be no reason for an eightfold path, but definitely our choices do affect our level of suffering. Yeah. And so this is not about a self or not self as much as it's about finding a way of explaining how things arise that removes the need for a doer and a result of what is done. You know, those are just parts in all of the things that we see going on. Okay, so just a moment. I tried to give you some feedback because I couldn't see your little. Did that make any sense? It doesn't feel like it makes sense, but I know this is what I've learned enough about dependent origination to say it's easy to say, oh, ignorance is a condition for volitional formations. It's a whole nother thing to understand like what's being got here. Like the Buddha says, all conditioned things, well, actually, all things are anatta. They are not self. They have this not self nature. None of these things, because they are of the nature to arise and cease, none of them can be yourself. And also the nibbana element, that which does not arise and does not cease, also can't be yourself, right? Because your sense of self can be seen to arise and cease. Therefore, it is not the nibbana element. It is not the unconditioned. It is very much conditioned. Because you can see how sometimes you're feeling really generous and content and at peace with the world. And that sense of self is clearly not there because you're not suffering. And then other times you're feeling a little bit stingy. Yeah. And you want to turn up the heat. You want to have something to eat. You want to, just relax. Yeah, you want to go to another room. And at those moments, you are experiencing suffering. There is a sense of self. And it's just that straightforward. When dependent origination is understood, you can see that these are two simultaneously occurring states of existence. Sometimes all of dependent origination is going and just keeping the mechanism of suffering going, putting fuel in the tank. And every now and then it's not. And many of the things that we assume are dependent on consciousness and subject and object and the six sense bases and all of that, actually the consciousness and the six sense bases and just the experience of being a living human being, they keep going in those moments where we're not suffering, right? You still see things, you still hear things, you still smell things. But in those moments, if you really look, something that isn't there is the craving, clinging, the becoming, and sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair, right? You're right, Laura. I can't say that without smiling. It's kind of funny, isn't it? That once you get suffering and you realize that it is impermanent, it is not always there. There's actually substantial gaps in your experience of suffering. You realize this is a doable project, right? It seems like we need to have a sense of self in order to function. But in those moments where these links don't arise, there is no problem. Things keep happening. But now, most importantly, there's the caveat, the conditions for the arising of consciousness are in the past. They are based on previous volitional formations, right? So some of the conditions for the arising of all of this stuff in the rest of dependent origination are external to consciousness. So even in those moments where things are going good, you're feeling really generous, you're feeling really loved, life is good, you are not suffering, still there is the potential for future suffering to arise as long as ignorance and volitional formations have not been completely removed, right? And that can only be done through realization and understanding, something that you do within the framework of consciousness and name and form and all of this. You practice, you apply your effort, you think in a very, this is me doing the practice kind of way, in order to set the conditions for the arising of those not me, not mine moments of being, right? Our practice starts as very subject oriented, very personal. This is about my suffering and getting out of it. But gradually over time, there is less and less need for that because more and more we're cultivating the conditions where dependent origination, those moments where it doesn't arise, where there is no sense of self, where there is no confusion about what is the definition of avijja, of not knowing. It's not knowing suffering, not knowing the cause of suffering, not knowing the cessation of suffering, and not knowing that there is a way to the cessation of suffering. Yeah, there are times when we see all of the things happening in the world and we're not forming any desire or attraction or clinging towards them. We're like, oh, yeah, politics. It's like that. It's like this. It's suffering. Yeah. Oh, yeah, weather. It's like this. Oh, yeah, human bodies. They're like this. And in those moments, we see things as they are. Everything has dukkha as one of their three characteristics. Yeah, because they are arising and ceasing, they can't permanently satisfy us, which means sometimes they're going to dissatisfy us. Sometimes they are going to be not pleasant. They have that characteristic. Okay, so we'll try again in a slightly different way, a slightly different sutta. Let's see how this goes. And again, I'll try to, it's hard to kind of put this into decent English, but we will try. So this is, what do we got? Pagana of the top knot. This is another wanderer who's, it's actually a monastic this time. That was his name, apparently. So the Buddha is giving a Dhamma talk and he's saying, monks, there are these four fuels, nutriments, ahara. They maintain sentient beings that have been born and help those who are about to be born. What for? Solid food, whether solid or subtle. Contact, sense contact is the second. Mental intention is the third. Consciousness is the fourth. These are the four nutriments that maintain sentient beings that have been born and help those who are about to be born. So we covered nutriment in a previous Daily retreat. Those who haven't can always go and see the recordings and the study materials for that. And this is what the Buddha is talking about, ahara. Now, ahara means food in a way. It means fuel. And so the Venerable Pagana, speaks up and he's like, Venerable Sir, you're saying fuel, but who is it who consumes the fuel? And the Buddha looks at him and he says, that's not a fitting question. I don't speak of one who consumes. If I were to speak of one who consumes, then it would be fitting to ask me who is the one who consumes. But have you been listening? I do not speak like that. Hence, it would be fitting to ask rather, consciousness is a fuel for what? So consciousness as one of the nutriments, one of the fuels. What is it a fuel for? Rather than asking, who is it a fuel for? Asking, what is it a fuel for? And the fitting answer to that question would be consciousness is a fuel that conditions rebirth into a new state of existence. When that which has been reborn is present, there are the six sense fields, and the six sense fields are a condition for contact. But sir, Pagana says, who makes sense contact? The Buddha says that's not a fitting question. And on they go. And the Buddha says a fitting question would be, what is the condition for contact? And the answer to that would be the six sense fields are a condition for contact. Contact is a condition for feeling. So we're saying there is contact before, there are the six sense bases. After, there is feeling. And Pagana says, but who feels? The Buddha says that's not a fitting question. A fitting question would be, what is the condition for feeling? And the answer, which the Buddha did just cover, is contact is a condition for feeling. And then feeling is a condition for craving. So the Buddha is kind of walking Pagana through the links of dependent origination. And at each one, there is the possibility for this question of, yeah, but who is doing this? And the Buddha is saying, well, this is what actually what dependent origination is for, is to not need to ask the question like that. We can see the one experience, we can know one experience, and then we can know what conditioned it and what it is conditioning. And that is enough. That is enough to actually do the work of figuring out what are those things that are leading to our suffering that we kind of want to work for the cessation of. And what are those things like the six sense bases, or namarupa, or consciousness, that will fix themselves at the time of death, that are not really a problem that needs to be dealt with, but just need to be known in the way that they are conditioning the feeling, craving, grasping, and becoming that come after. And Sapagana, asks who's the one who clings. And the Buddha talks about how clinging leads to bhava, or becoming. And then the Buddha, because he has walked Pagana through how the six sense bases lead to contact, lead to feeling, lead to craving, lead to grasping, lead to becoming. He says, when the six fields of contact fade away and cease with nothing left over, contact ceases. When contact ceases, feeling ceases. When feeling ceases, craving ceases. When craving ceases, grasping ceases. When grasping ceases, continued existence ceases. When continued existence ceases, rebirth ceases. When rebirth ceases, old age and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and despair cease. That is how the entire mass of suffering ceases. So, and you've, I don't know, for me, this is like, every 3 or 4 days, but maybe even in your own lives, this comes up. You're talking to somebody and says, oh, I read in this one Buddhist book that the Buddhists don't believe in a soul. And how is that? And maybe you found yourself saying, well, there's dependent origination. You see, with ignorance as condition, volitional formations arise. With volitional formations as condition, consciousness arises. And to you, it's so obvious, right? You're asking the wrong question. You're asking who when you should be asking what. Because what can be known, but the who is an assumption. There is an assumption that there is a person at the center of all this, holding it together through force of will. Whereas that very assumption will lead you to keep the conditions for your own suffering and misery going for infinity. We've all done a really great job at keeping our suffering going to the best of our ability. And fortunately, even in those times when we've slipped, even in those times when we've been a good person, when we've been content, when we've been really, really friendly and compassionate and wise, some of the conditions for our suffering were still safely tucked in past conditions and volition. And because we didn't see that, we didn't wake up to that, we didn't completely remove the underlying conditions for craving to arise, it was able to restart later and keep the thing going. So it was neither us doing it, yes, right? And that's the thing we can be sure of. If this samsara is a thing and we have existed since, immeasurable beginningless time, going through these cycles of rebirth from one existence to another, we can be quite certain that by just probability, there were some times when we really got it right and we were able to do things in a really good and satisfying way. But then we died. And the being that arose afterwards based on, all of the conditions that we put in place woke up, and they didn't have any of that wisdom. They didn't have any of that, all those satisfying things that we had gathered up. They didn't have all of the friends and family, and they were somewhere else very necessarily. They were born somewhere else than we had been. And all of the conditions that led to us having a really good run through a lifetime in samsara, we no longer had. And so maybe we didn't do so well the next time around. Yeah, and maybe we started to form desire. And this is why samsara is often depicted as a wheel, the wheel of samsara, because you can't always be moving in the right direction. Usually you will circle back around into these states unless we get rid of them. So how do we get rid of them though? Well, part of this is learning to trust dependent origination and learning to see it's not about me, it's not about mine. It's about this thing conditions this thing conditions this thing. And again, touching it briefly, actually at the beginning of a whole run of going through the dependent origination this morning. But one of the really major conditions is grasping, craving, clinging, to views, opinions, to practices, rites, rituals, traditions, clinging to the idea of ourselves as as an entity. Surely I exist somewhere because I'm suffering. I must. I can't say exactly where I am, but it hurts, right? It's all of these views are actually one of the very first things we start to deal with, because when you start to understand how the things we do actually do contribute to our present and future suffering, you realize that's a big one. That clinging to a view or an opinion creates a ton of suffering in the present moment and usually ruins our day in a variety of ways, right? It leads to future suffering. And you start dealing with that. And as you start dealing with that, you've really greatly diminished one of the crucial links in dependent origination, right? Now, that does not immediately lead to you attaining stream entry and being set on your own, being on the perfect linear course towards enlightenment, 8 lifetimes or bust. But you see, it does remove the thing that keeps the mechanism going, right? And if you can sustain that, then eventually this part of dependent origination is going to wear away. And once it's worn away enough, there's the possibility to have a realization, to have an insight where you cut it. You realize, all of the suffering that comes from clinging to a view can cease without remainder, never to arise again, if I just decide to stop clinging to views. And at first, that's a really good idea, and I wholly recommend it. And at first, it will just be an idea, right? You find yourself clinging to a certain view, and you're getting really mad. And then you say to yourself, if I didn't cling to this, I wouldn't be suffering. That's the worst time to be given wise advice, right? Because it's just so hard to act on it. But over time, through mindfulness and application, eventually we'll get to a point where it doesn't take a lot of effort to remind ourselves, oh, I see clinging to a view coming in the distance. And we're not even in the conversation yet, but we can see the person and the place, and we know what it's leading to. And we say, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to get involved in that argument. I'm not going to cling to that view. And that's dependent origination, right? You're not putting your sense bases in that place so contact can't arise, and contact doesn't arise so unpleasant feeling doesn't arise, and unpleasant feeling doesn't arise. So therefore you can't crave to get rid of the unpleasant feeling. Yeah. And if you're not craving to get rid of an unpleasant feeling or to cling to a pleasant feeling, then there is no clinging in that time. Yeah. So you can't actually just let go of the view in the moment and expect, okay, I'm done with clinging. That was it. That was the last view I will ever hold on to. No, you have to go further up the line. And likewise with consciousness, it just can't be that you're having a good, perfect, lovely moment where you're content and there's no suffering arising. And you can expect, this is the end of suffering. I've attained it. This is it. This is the goal. I'm good. Because are there still conditions further up? Have you been getting out of the way of them? Yeah. And do you understand them so completely that you have learned how to get out of the way of them permanently? Right. And there are ways to do that. We look at the conduct of the enlightened beings, and in each stage of enlightenment, you will see that there is conduct that those enlightened beings will never do. And it's not that they never find themselves necessarily in the situation. The situations come up. China invaded Tibet, and you have all those Tibetan monks, and some of them were very enlightened, very realized, but that didn't help them not be in the middle of a war zone, right? And some were killed and some fled. All of them responded to the situation in the best way that they had available. And so just being enlightened doesn't mean you'll get out of it, but there is something that you could have seen, looking at each one of them. At each stage of enlightenment, there will be ways that they will not respond to the situation. And when we talk about sankhara, volitional formations, this is exactly, that is the cut that you make. Yeah. You're deciding that the volitional formation of killing another person or stealing or lying, That is a volitional formation that we're just not going to do anymore. We're going to cut that out. And that is what the Buddha calls a noble virtue, right? It sounds good in theory, or maybe it doesn't even sound good in theory. We've had these conversations too, where it's like, that sounds like a terrible idea. That sounds like that is going to really not work out for you. But if you talk to anybody who has made that cut and made that decision and come to that realization, it was the best decision they've ever made, right? Because everything after that is free of that entire mass of suffering that comes dependent on that volition. So this is why removing the ignorance and volition is outside of the thing that we can just do in the moment. We can't just make a decision like, I'm going to be a stream enterer, but we can set all of the conditions, yeah, really work on it and learn to get away from the fetters and the causes of that problem arising, such that when the time comes, we actually do make that decision. And we make that decision within the conscious moment. Yeah. We're making a conscious decision to never do those volitional activities again. But once that decision is made, that decision also becomes outside of consciousness. It becomes a preceding, a past condition that cannot be overridden anymore. Right? The structure that allowed us to make that decision that leads to suffering is not something we're in control of anymore. We have decided to give it up, intentionally given it up. And once it's gone, right? Because again, consciousness is not all that. We really like to think that we're in control of things, but actually a lot of the structures and volitional formations are just way higher hierarchy of order of things, yeah? And they can keep things going. Even if we're deciding really hard that we don't want them to keep going, they'll keep going, yeah, because the structures are in place. They've been put in place. But once you decide to give them up and you understand them, and you have the spiritual basis, the faith, the energy, the mindfulness, the concentration, the wisdom, in order to effectively make that cut, then you don't have volition. You don't have volition because you saw things as they were. You had vijja rather than avijja. You had knowing, understanding rather than ignorance. Because of that, you stop the volition from happening. And yeah, after that, everything's good. The life will continue to play out. You were born, so you will grow old and die. There's no need to interrupt it. It's just a natural process. But the causes of suffering that preceded it can never arise. So no more suffering. Okay. Okay. And again, we talk about this, and it's more in the wisdom category of the teachings, and something to just think about, to mull over. And if anything, it probably will help inform the next time you're perusing the suttas and you come across ideas like this. And maybe you'll be able to recognize them just that much more quickly and say, this is where the Buddha is talking about not self. This is where the Buddha is talking about dependent origination. This is where the Buddha is talking about removing volitional activities. This is where the Buddha is talking about, because you understand, you don't do the thing that leads to suffering. I get it. This was the Buddha's insight. This is what he taught for 45 years. This is what's been passed on for 2,600 years. And here I am getting it, hopefully. Okay. Or we'll just sit and meditate and we'll have a good rest of the afternoon. That wouldn't be so bad either. Okay. So yeah, it's now 3 Eastern, and we'll sit for another, or sit or walk for another hour and a half. And if anybody's still around, then we'll come back at the end and have a discussion.